days later, a new kid was assigned to Group D. His name was Brian, but X-Ray called him Twitch because he was always fidgeting. Twitch was assigned Zero's bed and Zero's crate. Vacancies don't last long at Camp Green Lake. Twitch had been arrested for stealing a car. He claimed he could break into a car, disconnect the alarm, and hotwire the engine all in less than a minute. I never really planned to steal one, he told them. But sometimes, I'll be walking past a real nice car parked in this deserted area, and I'll just start twitching. If you think I'm twitching now, you should see me when I'm around a car. The next thing I know, I'm behind the wheel. Stanley lay on his scratchy sheets. It occurred to him that his cot no longer smelled bad. He wondered if the smell had gone away or if he'd just gotten used to it. Hey, caveman, said Twitch. Do we really need to get up at 4:30? You get used to it, Stanley told him. It's the coolest part of the day. He tried not to think about Zero. It was too late. Either he'd make it to the Big Thumb or... What worried him the most, however, wasn't that it was too late. What worried him the most was what really ate at his insides was the fear that it wasn't too late. What if Zero was still alive, desperately crawling across the dirt, searching for water? He tried to force the image out of his mind. Next morning, out on the lake, Stanley listened as Mr. Sir told the requirements to Twitch for the hole. As wide and as deep as your shovel, he told him. Twitch fidgeted. His finger drummed against the wooden shaft of the shovel. His neck moved from side to side. You won't be twitching so much after a day of digging, Mr. Sir told him. You won't have the strength to wiggle your pinky. He popped some sunflower seeds in his mouth, deftly chewed them, and spat out the shells. This isn't Girl Scout camp. The water truck came shortly after sunrise. Stanley got in line behind Magnet ahead of Twitch. What if it's not too late? He watched Mr. Sir fill X-Ray's canteen. The image of Zero crawling across the hot, dry dirt remained in his head. But what could he do about it? Even if Zero was somehow alive, and after more than 4 days, how would Stanley ever find him? It would take days. He'd need a car or a pickup truck. A pickup truck with a tank of water in the back. Stanley wondered if Mr. Sir had left the keys in the ignition. He slowly backed away from the line, then circled over to the side of the truck. He looked through the window. The keys were there, dangling in the ignition. Stanley felt his fingers start to twitch. He took a deep breath to steady himself and tried to think clearly. He had never driven before, but how hard could it really be? This is really crazy, he told himself. Whatever he did, he knew he had to do it quickly before Mr. Sir noticed. It's too late, he told himself. Zero couldn't have survived. But what if it wasn't? He took another deep breath. Think about this, he told himself. But there wasn't time to think. He flung open the doors to the truck and climbed quickly inside. Hey! Shouted Mr. Sir. He turned the key and stepped on the gas pedal. The engine revved. The truck didn't move. He pressed the pedal to the floor. The engine roared, but the truck was motionless. Mr. Sir came running around the side of the truck. The door was still open. Put it in gear! Shouted Twitch. The gear shift was on the floor next to the seat. Stanley pulled the lever back until the arrow pointed to the letter D for drive. The truck lurched forward. Stanley jerked back against the seat and tightly gripped the wheel as the truck accelerated. His foot was pressed to the floor. The truck went faster and faster and faster across the dry lake bed and bounced over a pile of dirt. Suddenly, Stanley was slammed forward and instantly backward as the airbag exploded in his face. He fell out of the open door and onto the ground. He had driven straight into a hole. He lay on the dirt staring at the truck, which stuck lopsided into the ground. He sighed. He couldn't blame his no-good, dirty, rotten pig-stealing great-grandfather this time. This time it was his own fault, 100%. He had probably just done the stupidest things he would ever manage to do in his short and miserable life. He managed to get to his feet. He was sore, but he didn't think he had any broken bones. He glanced back at Mr. Sir, who remained where he was, staring at Stanley. He ran. His canteen was strapped around his neck, and it banged against his chest as he ran. And every time it hit against him, it reminded him that it was empty, empty, empty. He slowed to a walk. As far as he could tell, nobody was chasing him. He could hear voices coming from back by the truck, but he couldn't make out the words. Occasionally he heard the revving of the engine, but the truck wasn't going anywhere soon. He headed in what he thought was the direction of the big thumb. He couldn't see it through the haze. Walking helped him calm him down and allowed him to think clearly. He doubted he would make it to Big Thumb, and with no water in his canteen, he didn't want to risk his life on a hope that he'd find refuge there. He'd have to return to camp. He knew that, but he was in no hurry. It would be better to return later, after everyone had a chance to calm down. And as long as he'd come this far, he might as well look for Zero. He decided to walk as long as he could, until he was too weak to go any farther. Then he'd turn around and go back. He smiled as he realized this wouldn't quite work. He would only go halfway as far as he thought he could go, so that he'd still have the strength to return. Then he'd have to make a deal with the warden, tell her where he'd find Kate Barlow's lipstick tube, and beg for mercy. He was surprised by even how far the holes extended. He couldn't even see the camp compound anymore, but he kept still passing holes. Just when he thought he'd passed the last hole, he'd come again to another cluster of them, a little farther away this time. Back at the compound, they had dug in a systematic order, row upon row, allowing space for the water truck. But out here, there was no system. It was as if, every once in a while, in a fit of frustration, the warden would just pick a spot at random and say, "What the hell, dig here!" It was like trying to guess the winning numbers in a lottery. Stanley found himself looking down each hole he passed. He didn't admit to himself what he was looking for. After more than an hour had gone by, he thought he'd surely seen the last hole. But then, off to the left, he saw another cluster of them. He actually didn't see the holes. He just saw the mounds of dirt that surrounded them. He stepped over the mounds and looked into the first hole. His heart stopped. Down at the bottom was a family of yellow-spotted lizards. Their large eyes looked up into him, red. He leapt back over the mound and ran. He didn't know if they were chasing after him. He thought he might have seen one leap out of the hole. He ran until he couldn't run any farther, then collapsed. They hadn't come after him. He sat there a while and caught his breath. As he got back to his feet, he thought he noticed something on the ground, maybe 50 yards away. It didn't look like much. A large rock, maybe, but in a land of nothingness, the little thing seemed unusual. He walked slowly towards it. The encounter with the lizards had made him very, very cautious. It turned out to be an empty sack of sunflower seeds. He wondered if it was the same one Magnet had stolen from Mr. Sir, although that didn't seem likely. He turned it inside out and found one seed stuck to the burlap. Lunch. The sun was almost directly overhead. He figured he could walk for no more than another hour, maybe 2, before he had to turn back. It seemed pointless. He could see there was nothing ahead of him, nothing but emptiness. He was hot, tired, hungry, and most of all, thirsty. Maybe he should just turn back around now. Maybe he'd already gone halfway and didn't know it. Then, looking around, he saw a pool of water less than 100 yards away from where he was standing. He closed his eyes and opened them to make sure he wasn't imagining it. The pool was still there. He hurried towards it. The pool hurried away from him, moving as he moved, stopping when he stopped. There wasn't any water. It was a mirage caused by the shimmering waves of heat rising off the dry ground. He kept walking. He still carried the empty sack of sunflower seeds. He didn't know if he'd find something to put in it. After a while, he could make out another shape of the mountains through the haze. At first, he wasn't sure if this was another kind of mirage, but the farther he walked, the clearer they came into view. Almost straight ahead of him, he could see what looked like a fist with its thumb sticking up. He didn't know how far away it was. 5 miles? 50 miles? One thing was certain. It was more than halfway. He knew he'd have to turn around before he got there. But every time he looked at it, it seemed to encourage him, giving him the thumbs up sign. As he continued walking, he became aware of a large object on the lake. He couldn't tell what it was, or even if it was natural or man-made. It looked a little like a fallen tree, although it didn't seem likely that a tree would grow here. More likely it was a ridge of dirt or rocks. The object, whatever it was not on the way of the big thumb, but off to the right. He tried to decide whether to go to it or continue towards the big thumb, or maybe just turn around. There's no point in heading towards Big Thumb, he decided. He would never make it. For all he knew, it was like chasing the moon. But he could make it to the mysterious object. He changed directions. He doubted it was anything, but the fact that there was something in the middle of all this nothing made it hard for him to pass up. He decided to make the object his halfway point, and he hoped that he hadn't already gone too far. He laughed to himself when he saw what it was. It was a boat, or part of a boat, anyway. It struck him as funny to see a boat in the middle of this dry and barren landscape. But after all, he realized, this was once a lake. The boat lay upside down, half buried in the dirt. Somebody may have drowned here, he thought grimly, at the same spot where he could very well die of thirst. The name of the boat had been painted on the back. The upside-down red letters were peeling and faded, but Stanley could still read the name Mary Lou. On one side of the boat, there was a pile of dirt and a tunnel leading down below the boat. The tunnel looked big enough for a good-sized animal to crawl through. He heard a noise. Something stirred under the boat. It was coming out. "Hey!" Stanley shouted, hoping to scare it back inside. His mouth was very dry, and it was hard to shout very loudly. "Hey," the thing answered weakly. Then a dark hand and an orange sleeve reached up out of the tunnel. Zero's face looked like a jack-o'-lantern that had been left out too many days past Halloween, half rotten with sunken eyes and a drooping smile. Is that water?" he asked. His voice was weak and raspy. His lips were so pale they were almost white, and his tongue seemed to flop around uselessly in his mouth as he spoke, as if it kept getting in the way. "It's empty," said Stanley. He stared at Zero, not quite believing that he was real. I tried to bring you the whole water truck, but," he smiled sheepishly. "I drove it into a hole. I can't believe you're—" "Me neither," said Zero. "Come on, we gotta get back to camp." Zero shook his head. I'm not going back." You have to. We both have to. You want some sploosh? Zero asked. What? Zero shaded his eyes with his forearm. It's cooler under the boat, he said. Stanley watched Zero crawl back up through his hole. It was a miracle he was still alive, but Stanley knew he would have to get him back to camp soon, even if he had to carry him. He crawled through after him and was just able to squeeze his body through the hole. He would never would have fit when he first came to Green Lake. He'd lost a lot of weight. As he pulled himself through, his legs struck something sharp and hard. It was a shovel. For a second, Stanley wondered how it got there. But he remembered that Zero had taken it with him after striking Mr. Budensky. It was cooler under the boat, which was half buried in the dirt. There were enough cracks and holes in the bottom of the boat, now the roof, to provide light and ventilation. He could see empty jars scattered about. Zero held a jar in his hand and grunted as he tried to unscrew the lid. What is it? Sploosh. His voice was strained as he worked on the jar. That's what I call it. They were buried under the boat. He still couldn't get the lid off. I found 16 jars. Here, hand me the shovel. Stanley didn't have a lot of room to move. He reached behind him, grabbed the wooden end of the shovel, and held it out to Zero, blade first. Sometimes you just have to, Zero said, and then he hit the jar against the blade of the shovel, breaking the top of the jar clean off. He quickly brought the jar to his mouth and licked the sploosh off the jagged edges before it spilled. Careful, Stanley warned. Zero picked up the cracked lid and licked the sploosh off that as well. Then he handed the broken jar to Stanley. Drink some as well. Stanley held it in his hand and stared at it in a moment. He was afraid of the broken glass. He was also afraid of the sploosh. It looked like mud. Whatever it was, he realized, it must have been here when the boat sank. That meant it was probably over 100 years old. Who knew what kind of bacteria might be living in it? It's good, said Zero, encouraging him. He wondered if Zero had heard of bacteria. He raised the jar to his mouth and carefully took a small sip. It was warm, bubbly, mushy nectar, sweet and tangy. It felt like heaven as it flowed over his dry mouth and down his parched throat. He thought it might have been some kind of fruit at the time, perhaps peaches. Zero smiled at him. I told you it was good. Stanley didn't want to drink too much, but it was too good to resist. They passed the jar back and forth until it was empty. How many are left? He asked. None, said Zero. Stanley's mouth dropped. Now I have to take you back, he said. I'm not digging any more holes, said Zero. They won't make you dig, Stanley promised. They'd probably send you to a hospital like Big Barf. Big Barf stepped on a rattlesnake, said Zero. Stanley remembered how he'd almost done the same. I guess he didn't hear the rattle? He did it on purpose, said Zero. You think? He took off his shoe and sock first. Stanley shivered as he tried to imagine it. What's Marialuhu? Asked Zero. What? Zero concentrated hard. Marialuhu. I have no idea. I'll show you, said Zero. He crawled back out from the boat. Stanley followed. Back outside, he had to shield his eyes from the brightness. Zero walked around to the back of the boat and pointed to the upside-down letters. Marialuhu. Stanley smiled. Mary Lou. It's the name of the boat. Mary Lou, Zero repeated, studying the letters. I thought the Y sound made a Y sound. It does, said Stanley, but not when it's at the end of a word. Sometimes Y is a vowel and sometimes it's a consonant. console tent. Zero suddenly groaned. He grabbed his stomach and bent over. Are you all right? Zero dropped to the ground. He lay on his side, and his knees pulled up to his chest. He continued to groan loudly. Stanley watched, helpless. He wondered if it was the sploosh. He looked back towards Camp Green Lake. At least he thought it was the direction of Camp Green Lake. He wasn't entirely sure. Zero stopped moaning, and his body slowly unbent. I'm taking you back, said Stanley. Zero managed to sit up. He took several deep breaths. Look, I've got a plan so you won't get in trouble, Stanley assured him. Remember when I found the gold tube? Remember when I gave it to X-Ray and the warden went crazy making us dig where she thought X-Ray found it? I think if I tell the warden where I really found it, I think she'll let us off. I'm not going back, said Zero. You've got nowhere else to go, said Stanley. Zero said nothing. You'll die out here, said Stanley. Then I'll die out here. Stanley didn't know what to do. He had come to rescue Zero and instead drank the last of his sploosh. He looked off into the distance. I want you to look at something. I just want you to look at that mountain over there. See the one with something sticking out of it? Yeah, I think. What does it look like to you? Does it look like anything? Zero said nothing. But as he studied the mountain, his right hand slowly formed into a fist. He raised his thumb. His eyes went from the mountain to his hand, then back to the mountain. They put 4 of the unbroken jars in the burlap sack, in case they might be able to use them. Stanley carried the sack. Zero held the shovel. I should warn you, Stanley said. I'm not exactly the luckiest guy in the world. Zero wasn't worried. When you spent your whole life living in a hole, he said, the only way you can go is up. They gave each other the thumbs up sign, then headed out. It was the hottest part of the day. Stanley's empty canteen was still strapped under his neck. He thought back to the water truck and wished he'd at least stopped and filled his canteen before running off. They hadn't gone very far before Zero had another attack. He clutched his stomach, and as he let himself fall to the ground, Stanley could only wait for it to pass. The sploosh had saved Zero's life, but it was now destroying him from the inside. He wondered how long it would be before he, too, felt the effects. He looked at Big Thumb. It didn't seem any closer than when they first started. Zero took a deep breath and managed to sit up. Can you walk? Stanley asked. Just give me a second, Zero said. He took another breath, then using the shovel, pulled himself back to his feet. He gave Stanley the thumbs up sign, and they continued. Sometimes Stanley would try to go for a long while without looking at Big Thumb. He'd make a mental snapshot of how it looked, then wait another 10 minutes before looking at it again to see if it seemed closer. It never did. It was like chasing the moon. And if they ever reached it, he realized, they'd still have to climb it. I wonder who she was, said Zero. Who? Mary Lou, said Zero. Stanley smiled. I guess she was once a real person on a real lake. It's hard to imagine. I bet she was pretty, said Zero. Somebody must have loved her a lot to name a boat after her. Yeah, said Stanley. I bet she looked great in a bathing suit, sitting in the boat with their boyfriend rowing. Zero used the shovel as a third leg. 2 legs weren't enough to keep him up. I've got to stop and rest, he said after a while. Stanley looked at Big Thumb. It still didn't look any closer. He was afraid if Zero stopped, he might never get started again. We're almost there, he said. He wondered which was closer, Camp Green Lake or Big Thumb. I really have to sit down. Just see if you can go a little. Zero collapsed. The shovel stayed up a fraction of a second longer, perfectly balanced on the tip of the blade. Then it fell next to him. Zero knelt, bent over with his head on the ground. Stanley could hear a very low moaning sound coming from him. He looked at the shovel and couldn't help but think that he might need to dig a grave. Zero's last hole. And who will dig a grave for me, he thought. But Zero did get up, once again flashing thumbs up. Give me some words, he said weakly. It took Stanley a few seconds to realize what he meant. Then he smiled and said, R-U-N. Zero sounded it out to himself. Run, run, run. Good. F-U-N. F-un. The spelling seemed to help Zero. It gave him something to concentrate on, besides his pain and weakness. It distracted Stanley as well. The next time he looked at Big Thumb, it really did seem closer. They quit spelling words when it hurt too much to talk. Stanley's throat was dry. He was weak and exhausted, yet as bad as he felt, he knew that Zero felt 10 times worse. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going too. It was possible, he thought. He hoped that he didn't get any of the bad bacteria. Zero hadn't been able to unscrew the lid. Maybe the bad germs couldn't get in either. Maybe the bacteria was only in the jars which opened easily, which he was now carrying in his sack. What scared Stanley the most about dying wasn't his actual death. He figured he could handle the pain. It wouldn't be much worse than what he felt now. In fact, maybe at the moment of his death, he would be too weak to feel the pain. Death would be a relief. What worried him was the thought that his parents, not knowing what happened to him, not knowing whether he was dead or alive. He hated to imagine what it would be like for his mother and father, day after day, month after month, not knowing, living on false hope. For him, at least, it would be over. For his parents, the pain would never end. He wondered if the warden would send out a search party to look for him. It didn't really seem likely. She didn't send anyone to look for Zero, but no one cared about Zero. They simply destroyed his files. But Stanley had a family. She couldn't pretend he was never there. He wondered what she would tell them, and when. What do you think's up there? Zero asked. Stanley looked to the top of Big Thumb. Oh, probably an Italian restaurant, he said. Zero managed to laugh. I think I'll get a pepperoni pizza and a large root beer, said Stanley. I want an ice cream sandwich, said Zero, with nuts and whipped cream and bananas and hot fudge. The sun was almost directly in front of them. The thumb pointed up towards it. They came to the end of the lake. Huge white stone cliff rose before them. Unlike the eastern shore, where Camp Green Lake was situated, the western shore did not slope down gradually. It was as if they'd been walking across the flat bottom of a giant frying pan, and now they had to somehow climb out of it. They could no longer see Big Thumb. The cliffs blocked their view. The cliffs also blocked the sun. Zero groaned and clutched his stomach, but he remained standing. I'm all right, he whispered. Stanley saw a rut about a foot wide and 6 inches deep, running down a cliff. On either side of the rut were a series of ledges. Let's try there, he said. It looked to be about 50-foot climb, straight upwards. Stanley still managed to hold the sack of jars in his left hand as he slowly moved up, from ledge to ledge, crisscrossing the rut. At times he had to use the side of the rut for support, in order to make it to the next ledge. Zero stayed with him somehow. His frail body trembled terribly as he climbed the stone wall. Some of the ledges were wide enough to sit on. Others stuck out no more than a few inches, just enough for a quick step. Stanley stopped about 2/3 of the way up on a fairly wide ledge. Zero came up alongside him. "You okay?" Stanley asked. Zero gave the thumbs up sign. Stanley did the same. He looked above him. He wasn't sure how he'd get to the next ledge. It was 3 or 4 feet above his head, and he didn't see any footholds. He was afraid to look down. Give me a boost," said Zero. Then I'll pull you up with the shovel." "You won't be able to pull me up, though," said Stanley. Yes, I will," said Zero. Stanley cupped his hands together, and Zero stepped on the interwoven fingers. He was able to lift Zero high enough for him to grab the protruding slab of rock. Stanley continued to help him from below as Zero pulled himself onto the ledge. While Zero was getting himself situated up there, Stanley attached the sack to the shovel by poking a hole through the burlap. He held it up to Zero. Zero first grabbed hold of the sack, then the shovel. He set the shovel down so that half the blade was supported by the rock slab. The wooden shaft hung down towards Stanley. "Okay," he said. Stanley doubted this would work. It was one thing for him to lift Zero, who was half his weight. It was quite another for Zero to try to pull him up. Stanley grabbed hold of the shovel as he climbed out of the rock wall, using the sides of the rut to help support him. His hands moved from one over the other, up the shaft of the shovel. He felt Zero's hand clasp his wrist. He let go of the shaft with one hand and grabbed the top ledge. He gathered his strength and for a brief second seemed to defy gravity as he took a quick step up the wall and with Zero's help pulled himself the rest of the way onto the ledge. He caught his breath. There was no way he could have done that a few minutes ago. He noticed a large spot of blood on his wrist. It took him a moment to realize it was Zero's blood. Zero had deep gashes in both hands. He'd held onto the metal blade of the shovel, keeping it in place as Stanley climbed. Zero brought his hands to his mouth and sucked up the blood. One of the glass jars had broken in the sack. They decided to save the pieces. They might need to make a knife or something. They rested briefly, then continued up. It was fairly easy climb the rest of the way. When they reached flat ground, Stanley looked up to see the sun, a fiery ball balancing on top of Big Thumb. God was twirling a basketball. Soon they were walking in the long, thin shadow of the thumb. "We're almost there," said Stanley. He could see the base of the mountain. Now that they were really almost there, it scared him. Big Thumb was his only hope. If there was no water, no refuge, then they'd have nothing, not even hope. There was no exact place where the flat land stopped and the mountain began. The ground got steeper and steeper, and then there was no doubt they were heading up the mountain. Stanley could no longer see Big Thumb. The slope of the mountain was in the way. It became too steep to go straight up. Instead, they zigzagged back and forth, increasing their altitude by small increments every time they changed direction. Patches of weeds dotted the mountainside. They walked from one patch to another, using the weeds as footholds. As they got higher, the weeds got thicker. Many had thorns, and they had to be careful walking through them. Stanley would have liked to stop and rest, but he was afraid they'd never get started again. As long as Zero could keep going, he knew he could keep going too. Besides, he knew they didn't have much daylight left. As the sky darkened, bugs began appearing in the weed patches. A swarm of gnats hovered around them, attracted by their sweat. Neither Stanley nor Zero had enough strength to try to swat at them. How are you doing?" Stanley asked. Zero pointed thumbs up. Then he said, "If a knot lands on me, it will knock me over." Stanley gave him some more words. "Bugs," he spelled. Zero concentrated hard, then said, "Boogs." Stanley laughed. A wide smile spread across Zero's sick and weary face. Bugs, he said. Good, said Stanley. Remember, it's a short U if there's no E at the end. Okay, here's a hard one. How about Lunch? Lum. Suddenly, Zero made a horrible wrenching noise as he doubled over and grabbed his stomach. His frail body suddenly shook violently, and he threw up, emptying his stomach of the sploosh. He leaned on his knees and took several deep breaths. Then he straightened up and continued going. A swarm of knots stayed behind, preferring the contents of Zero's stomach to the sweat on the boys' faces. Stanley didn't give him many more words, thinking that he needed to save his strength. But about 10 or 15 minutes later, Zero said, "Lunch." As they climbed higher, the patches of weeds grew thicker, and they had to be careful not to get their feet tangled in thorny vines. Stanley suddenly realized something. There hadn't been any weeds on the lake. Weeds and bugs, he said. There's got to be water around here. We must be getting closer. A wide clown smile spread across Zero's face. He flashed the thumbs up sign, then fell. He didn't get up. Stanley bent over him. Come on, Zero, he urged. We're getting closer. Come on, Hector. Weeds and bugs. Weeds and boogs. Stanley shook him. I've already ordered your hot fudge sundae, he said. They're making it right now. Zero said nothing. Stanley took hold of Zero's forearms and pulled him upright. Then he stooped down and let Zero fall over his right shoulder. He stood up, lifting Zero's worn-out body off the ground. He left the shovel and sack of jars behind as he continued up the mountain, Zero's legs dangling in front of him. Stanley couldn't see his feet, which made it difficult to walk through the tangled patches of weeds and vines. He concentrated on one step at a time, carefully raising and setting down each foot. He thought only about each step and not the impossible task that lay before him. Higher and higher he climbed. His strength came from somewhere deep inside him and seemed to come from the outside as well. After focusing on Big Thumb for so long, it was as if the rock had absorbed his energy and now acted like a kind of giant magnet, pulling him towards it. After a while, he became aware of a foul odor. At first, he thought it came from Zero, but it seemed to be in the air, hanging heavy all around him. He also noticed that the ground wasn't as steep anymore. As the ground flattened, a huge stone precisely rose up ahead of him, just barely visible in the moonlight. It seemed to grow bigger with each step he took. It no longer resembled a thumb, and he knew he'd never be able to climb it. Around him, the smell became stronger. It was the bitter smell of despair. Even if he couldn't somehow climb Big Thumb, he knew he wouldn't find water. How could there only be water at the top of the giant rock? The weeds and bugs survived only by an occasional rainstorm like the one he'd seen from camp. Still, he continued towards it. If nothing else, he wanted to reach the thumb. He never made it. His feet slipped out from under him. Zero's head knocked against the back of his shoulder as he fell and tumbled in a small, muddy gully. As he lay face down in the muddy ditch, he didn't even know if he'd ever get up again. He didn't know if he'd ever try. Had he come all this way just to... You need water to make mud! He crawled along the gully in the direction that seemed the muddiest. The ground became gloppier. The mud splashed up as he slapped the ground. Using both hands, he dug a hole in the soggy soil. It was too dark to see, but he thought he could feel a tiny pool of water at the bottom of the hole. He stuck his head in the hole and licked the dirt. He dug deeper, and as he did so, more water seemed to fill the hole. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it, first with his fingers, then with his tongue. He dug long enough until there was a hole that was about as deep as his arms was long. There was enough water for him to scoop out with his hands and drop on Zero's face. Zero's eyes remained closed, but his tongue poked out between his lips, searching out for droplets. Stanley dragged Zero closer to the hole. He dug, then scooped some more water and let it pour out of his hands into Zero's mouth. As he continued to widen his hole, his hand came across a smooth, round object. It was too smooth and too round to be a rock. He wiped the dirt off it and realized it was an onion. He bit into it without peeling it. The hot, bitter juice burst into his mouth. He could feel it all the way up to his eyes, and when he swallowed, he felt its warmth move down his throat and into his stomach. He only ate half. He gave the other half to Zero. "Here, eat this." What is it?" Zero whispered. "A hot fudge sundae." Stanley awoke in the meadow, looking up at the giant rock tower. It was layered and streaked with different shades of red, burnt orange, brown, and tan. It must have been over 100 feet tall. Stanley lay a while, just looking at it. He didn't have the strength to get up. It felt like the insides of his mouth and throat were coated with sand. And no wonder. When he rolled over, he saw the water hole. It was about 2.5 feet deep and over 3 feet wide. At the bottom lay no more than 2 inches of very brown water. His hands and fingers were sore from digging, especially under his fingernails. He scooped some dirty water into his mouth, then swished it around, trying to filter it with his teeth. Zero moaned. Stanley started to say something, but no words came to his mouth, and he had to try again. "How are you doing?" It hurt to talk. "Not good," Zero said quietly. With great effort, he rolled over, raised himself to his knees, and crawled to the water hole. He lowered his head into it and lapped up some water. Then he jerked back, clutching his knees to his chest, and rolled over to the side. His body shook violently. Stanley thought about going back down the mountain to look for the shovel, so that he could make the water hole deeper. Maybe that would give them cleaner water. They could use the jars as drinking glasses. But he didn't think he had the strength to go down, let alone to make it back up again. And he didn't know where to look. He struggled to his feet. He was in a field of greenish-white flowers that seemed to extend all the way around Big Thumb. He took a giant breath and then walked the last 50 yards to the giant precipice and touched it. "Tag, you're it." Then he walked back to Zero and the water hole. On the way, he picked one of the flowers. It actually wasn't one big flower, he discovered, but instead, each flower was really a tiny little cluster of flowers that formed a round ball. He brought it to his mouth, but had to spit it out. He could see parts of the trail where he made the night before, when he carried Zero up the mountain. If he was going to head back down and look for the shovel, he realized he would have to do it soon, while the trail was fresh. But he didn't want to leave Zero. He was afraid Zero might die while he was gone. Zero was still lying, doubled over on his side. "I've got to tell you something," he said with a groan. "Don't talk," said Stanley. "Save your strength." "No, listen," Zero insisted. Then he closed his eyes as his face twisted with pain. "I'm listening," Stanley whispered. "I took your shoes," Zero said. Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. His shoes were right on his feet. "That's all right," he said. "Just rest now." "It's all my fault," said Zero. It's nobody's fault, said Stanley. I didn't know, Zero said. That's okay, Stanley said. Just rest. Zero closed his eyes, but then, I didn't know about the shoes. What shoes? From the shelter. It took a moment for Stanley to comprehend. Clyde Livingston's shoes? I'm sorry, said Zero. Stanley stared at him. It was impossible. Zero was delirious. Zero's confession seemed to bring him some relief. His muscles in his face relaxed. As he drifted into sleep, Stanley lay softly and sang to him the song that had been in his family for generations. If only the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the tree was just a little bit softer. While the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely, he cries to the moon. If only, if only. When Stanley found the onion the night before, he didn't question how it came to be there. He ate it gratefully. But now as he gazed at Big Thumb and the meadow full of flowers, he couldn't help but wonder about it. If there was one wild onion, there could be more. He intertwined his fingers, then tried to rub out the pain. Then he bent down and dug up another flower, this time pulling up the entire plant, including the root. Onions! Fresh, hot, sweet onions! Sam called as Mary Lou pulled the cart down Main Street. 8 cents a dozen! It was a beautiful spring morning. The sky was painted pale blue with pink, the same color as the lake and the peach trees along its shore. Mrs. Gladstone's was wearing her nightgown and robe as she came running down the street after Sam. Miss Tennyson was normally a very proper woman, who never went out in public without dressing up in a fine clothes and hat. So it was quite surprised to the people of Green Lake to see her running past them. Sam! Sam! She shouted. Whoa, Mary Lou, said Sam, stopping his mule and cart. Good morning, Miss Tennyson, he said. How's the little bucka doing? Gladstone's was all smiles. I think she's going to be all right. The fever broke about an hour ago, thanks to you. I'm sure the good Lord and Dr. Hawthorne deserve most of the credit. The good Lord, yes, agreed Miss Tennyson, but not Miss Dr. Hawthorne. That quack wanted to put leeches on her stomach. Leeches! My word, he said they would suck out the bad blood. Now you tell me, how would a leech know good blood from bad blood? I wouldn't know, said Sam. It was your onion tonic, said Miss Tennyson. That's what saved her. Other townspeople made their way to the car. Good morning, Dadless, said Hattie Parker. Don't you look lovely this morning? Several people snickered. Good morning, Hattie, Miss Tennyson replied. Does your husband know you're parading around in your bedclothes? Hattie asked. There were more snickers. My husband knows exactly where I am and how I'm dressed. Thank you very much, said Miss Tennyson. We both have been up all night and half the morning with Rebecca. She almost died from stomach sickness. It seems she ate some bad meat. Hattie's face flushed. Her husband, Jim Parker, was the butcher. It made my husband and me sick as well, said Miss Tennyson, but it nearly killed Becca. What with her being so young, Sam saved her life. It wasn't me, said Sam. It was the onions. I'm glad Becca's all right, Hattie said comfortably. I just kept telling Jim he needs to wash his knives, said Mr. Pike, who owned the general store. Hattie Parker excused herself, then turned and quickly walked away. Tell Becca that when she feels up to it, she can come by for the store for a piece of candy, said Mr. Pike. Thank you, I'll do that. Before returning home, Miss Tennyson brought a dozen onions from Sam. She gave him a dime, and told him to keep the change. I don't take charity, Sam told her, but if you want to buy a few extra onions for Mary Lou, I'm sure she'd appreciate it. All right then, said Miss Tennyson. Give me my change and onions. Sam gave Miss Tennyson an additional 3 onions, and she fed them one at a time to Mary Lou. She laughed as the old donkey ate them out of her hand. Stanley and Zero slept off and on for the next 2 nights, ate onions, all they wanted, and splashed dirty water into their mouths. In the late afternoon, Big Thumb gave them shade. Stanley tried to make the hole deeper, but he really needed the shovel. His efforts seemed just to stir up the mud and make the water dirtier. Zero was sleeping. He was still very sick and weak, but the sleep and the onions seemed to be doing him some good. Stanley was no longer afraid he would die soon. Still, he didn't want to go for the shovel while Zero wasn't asleep. He didn't want to wake him up and think he'd been deserted. He waited for Zero to open his eyes. I think I'll go look for the shovel, Stanley said. I'll wait here, Zero said feebly, as if he had any other choice. Stanley headed down the mountain. The sleep and the onions had done him some good as well. He felt strong. It was fairly easy to follow the trail as he made the 2 days earlier. There were a few places where he wasn't sure he was going the right way, but it just took a little bit of searching before he found the trail again. He went quite a ways down the mountain, but still didn't find the shovel. He looked back up towards the top of the mountain. He must have walked right past it, he thought. There's no way he could have carried Zero all the way up from here. Still, he headed downward, just in case. He came to a bare spot between 2 large patches of weeds and sat down to rest. Now he had definitely gone too far, he decided. He was tired out from walking down the hill, and it would have been impossible to have carried Zero up the hill from here, especially after walking all day with no food or water. The shovel must be buried in some weeds. Before starting back up again, he took one last look all around in all directions. He saw a large indentation in the weeds a little farther down the mountain. It didn't seem likely the shovel could be there, but he'd already come this far. There, lying in some tall weeds, he found the shovel and the sack of jars. He was amazed. He wondered if the shovel and the sack might have rolled down the hill, but none of the jars were broken, except for the one that had been broken earlier. If they'd rolled down the hill, it was undoubtful that he would have found the sack and the shovel side by side. On his way back up the mountain, Stanley had to sit down and rest several times. It was a long, hard climb. Zero's condition seemed to improve. Stanley slowly peeled an onion. He liked eating them one layer at a time. The water hole was almost as large as the holes he had dug back at Camp Green Lake. It contained almost 2 feet of murky water. Stanley had dug it all by himself. Zero had offered to help, but Stanley thought it better for Zero to save his strength. It was a lot harder to dig in water than it was to in a dry bed of lake. Stanley was surprised that he hadn't gotten sick, either from the sploosh, the dirty water, or from living on onions. He used to get sick quite a lot back at home. Both boys were barefoot. They had washed their socks. All their clothes were very dirty, but their socks were definitely the worst. They didn't dip their socks into the hole, afraid to contaminate the water. Instead, they filled the jars and poured the water over their dirty socks. I didn't go to the homeless shelter very often, Zero said. Just if the weather was really bad. I'd have to find someone to pretend to be my mom. If I'd just gone there by myself, they would have asked a bunch of questions. If they found out I didn't have a mom, they would have made me a ward of the state. What's a ward of the state? Zero smiled. I don't know, but I didn't like this. Zero became strong enough to help dig the hole. When he finished, it was over 6 feet deep. He filled the bottom with rocks to help separate the water from the dirt. he was still the best hole digger around. "That's the last hole I will ever dig," he declared, throwing down the shovel. Stanley smiled. He wished it was true, but he knew they had no choice but to eventually return to Camp Green Lake. They couldn't live on onions forever. They had been completely around Big Thumb. It was like a giant sundial. They followed the shade. They were able to see out in all directions. There was no place to go. The mountain was surrounded by desert. Zero stared at Big Thumb. "It must have a hole in it," he said, "filled with water. You think?" "Where else could the water be coming from?" Zero asked. "Water doesn't run uphill." Stanley bit into the onion. It didn't burn his eyes or nose, and in fact he no longer noticed a particularly strong taste. He remembered when he first carried Zero up the hill, how the air had smelled bitter. It was the smell of thousands of onions, growing and rotting and sprouting. Now he didn't smell a thing. "How many onions do you think we've eaten?" he asked. Zero shrugged. "I don't even know how long we've been here." "I'd say about a week," said Stanley. "And we probably eat about 20 onions a day, so that's 280 onions," said Zero. Stanley smiled. "I bet we really, really stink." 2 nights later, Stanley lay awake, staring at the star-filled sky. He was too happy to fall asleep. He knew he had no reason to be happy. He had heard or read somewhere that right before a person freezes to death, he feels suddenly nice and warm. He wondered if perhaps he was experiencing something like that. It occurred to him that he couldn't remember the last time he felt happiness. It wasn't just being sent to Camp Green Lake that made his life miserable. Before that, he'd been unhappy at school, where he had no friends and bullies like Derek Doone, who picked on him. If no one liked him, and the truth was, he didn't especially like himself. He liked himself now. He wondered if he was delirious. He looked over at Zero sleeping next to him. Zero's face was lit in the starlight, and there was a flower petal in front of his nose that moved back and forth as he breathed. It reminded Stanley of something out of a cartoon. Zero breathed in, and the petal was drawn almost touching his nose. Zero breathed out, and the petal moved towards his chin. It stayed on Zero's face for an amazingly long time before fluttering off to the side. Stanley considered placing it back on Zero's nose, but it wouldn't be the same. It seemed like Zero had been living at Camp Green Lake forever, but as Stanley thought about it now, he realized that Zero must have gotten in no more than a month or two before him. Zero was actually arrested a day later, but Stanley's trial kept getting delayed because of baseball. He remembered that Zero had a few days before said that it was Zero who just kept the shoes, that neither of them would be right here right now. As Stanley stared at the glittering night sky, he thought there was no place he'd rather be. He was glad Zero put the shoes on the parked car. He was glad they fell from an overpass and hit him on the head. When the shoes first fell from the sky, he remembered thinking that destiny had struck him. Now he thought so again. It was more than a coincidence. It had to be destiny. Maybe they wouldn't have to return to Camp Green Lake, he thought. Maybe they could make it past the camp, then follow the dirt road back to civilization. They could fill the sack with onions and 3 jars with water, and he had his canteen as well. They could refill the jars and canteen at the camp. Maybe sneak into the kitchen and grab some food? He doubted any counselors were still on guard. Everyone had to think they were dead. Buzzard food. It would mean living the rest of his life as a fugitive. The police would always be after him. At least he could call his parents and tell them he was still alive. But he couldn't go visit them, though, in case the police were watching the apartment. Although, if everyone thought he was dead, they wouldn't bother to watch the apartment. He would have to get some sort of new identity. Now I'm really thinking crazy, he thought. He wondered if a crazy person wonders if he's crazy. But even if he thought this, it was an even crazier idea kept popping into his head. He knew it was even too crazy to even consider. Still, if he was going to be a fugitive for the rest of his life, it would help to have some money. Perhaps a treasure chest full of money. You're crazy, he told himself. Besides, just because he found a lipstick container with KB on it doesn't mean that there was a treasure buried there. It was crazy. It was all part of his crazy feeling of happiness. Or maybe it was destiny. He reached over and shook Zero's arm. Hey, Zero, he whispered. Huh? Zero muttered. Zero, wake up. What? Zero raised up his head. What is it? You want to dig one more hole? Stanley asked him. We weren't always homeless, Zero said. I remember a yellow room. How old were you when you... Stanley started to ask, but he couldn't really find the right words. When you moved out. I don't know. I must have been real little because I don't remember too much. I don't remember moving out. I remember standing in a crib with my mother singing to me. She held my wrists and made my hands clap together. She used to sing that song to me. The one you sang. It was different, though. Zero spoke so slowly, as if searching his brains for memories and clues. And then later, I knew we lived on the street, but I don't know why we left the apartment. I'm pretty sure it was a house and not an apartment. I know my room was yellow. It was late afternoon. They were resting in the shadow of the thumb. They had spent the morning picking onions and putting them in the sack. It didn't take long, but long enough so that they had to wait another day before heading down the mountain. They wanted to leave at the first hint of daylight, so they'd have plenty of time to make it to Camp Green Lake before dark. Stanley wanted to be sure he could find the right hole. Then they would hide by it until everyone else went to sleep. They would dig for as long as it seemed safe, and not a second longer. And then, treasure or no treasure, they head up the dirt road. It was absolutely safe. They'd try to steal some food and water from the camp kitchens. I'm good at sneaking in and out of places, Zero had said. Remember, Stanley had warned, the door to the rec room squeaks. Now, as he lay on his back, trying to save his strength for the long days ahead, he wondered what happened to Zero's parents, but he didn't ask. Zero didn't like really answering questions. It was better to just let him talk when he felt like it. Stanley thought about his own parents. In her last letter, his mom was worried that they might be evicted from the apartment because of the smell of burning sneakers. They could easily become homeless as well. Again, he wondered if they had been told that he ran away from camp. Were they told that he was dead? An image appeared in his head of his parents hugging each other and crying. He tried not to think about it. Instead, he tried to recapture the feeling he'd have the night before. The inexplicable feeling of happiness. The sense of destiny. But those feelings didn't return. He just felt scared. The next morning, they headed down the mountain. They ducked their caps in the water hole before putting them on their heads. Zero held the shovel and Stanley carried the sack, which was crammed with onions and 3 jars of water. They left the pieces of broken jar on the mountain. This is where I found the shovel, Stanley said, pointing out to the patch of weeds. Zero turned and looked up towards the top of the mountain. That's a long way. You were light, Stanley said. You'd already thrown up everything that was inside your stomach. He shifted the sack from one shoulder to the other. It was heavy. He'd stepped on a loose rock, slipped, then fell hard. The next thing he knew, he was sliding down the steep side of the mountain. He dropped the sack, and onions spilled around him. He slid into a pile of weeds and grabbed into the thorny vine. The vine ripped out of the earth, but slowed him enough so that he was able to stop himself. "Are you all right?" Zero asked from above. Stanley groaned as he pulled one of the thorns out of his palm. "Yeah," he said. He was all right. He was worried more about the jars of water. Zero climbed down after him, retrieving the sack along the way. Stanley pulled some thorns out of his pant leg. The jars hadn't broken. The onions had protected them, like styrofoam packing material. "Glad you didn't do that when you were carrying me," Zero said. They had lost about a third of the onions, but recovered many of them as they continued down the mountain. When they reached the bottom, the sun was just rising above the lake. They walked directly towards it. Soon they stood on the edge of the cliff, looking down on the dry lake bed. Stanley wasn't sure, but he thought he could see the remains of the Mary Lou off in the distance. "You thirsty?" Stanley asked. "No. How about you?" "No," Stanley lied. He didn't want to be the first one to take a drink. Although they didn't mention it, it had become a kind of challenge between him and Zero. They climbed down into the frying pan. It was a different spot from where they climbed up. They eased themselves down one ledge to another, and then felt themselves slid in other places, being especially careful with the sack. Stanley could no longer see the Mary Lou, but he headed in what thought he was a familiar direction. As the sun rose, so did the familiar heat and haze of dirt. "You thirsty?" Zero asked. "No," said Stanley. "Because you have 3 full jars of water," said Zero. "I thought maybe it was getting too heavy for you. If you drink some, it'll lighten your load." "I'm not thirsty," said Stanley. "But if you want a drink, I'll give you some." "I'm not thirsty," said Zero. "I was just worried about you." Stanley smiled. "I'm a camel," he said. They walked for what seemed like a long time, and still never came across the Mary Lou. Stanley was pretty sure they headed in the right direction. He remembered that they had left the boat and were heading towards the setting sun. Now they were heading towards the rising sun. He knew the sun didn't rise and set exactly in the east and west, more southeast than southwest, but he wasn't sure how that made a difference. His throat felt as though it was coated with sandpaper. "You sure you're not thirsty?" he asked. "Not me," said Zero. His voice was dry and raspy. When they did finally take a drink, they agreed to do it at the same time. Zero, who was now carrying the sack, set it down and took out 2 jars, giving one to Stanley. They decided to save the canteen for last, since it couldn't accidentally break. "You know, I'm not thirsty," Stanley said as he unscrewed the lid. "I'm just drinking so you will." "I'm just drinking so you will," said Zero. They clinked the jars together and each watched the other pouring the water into their stubborn mouths. Zero was the first one to spot the Mary Lou, about a quarter-mile away, just a little off to the right. They headed for it. It wasn't even noon yet when they reached the boat. They sat against the shady side and rested. "I don't know what happened to my mother," Zero said. "She left and never came back." Stanley peeled an onion. "She couldn't always take me with her," Zero said. "Sometimes she had to do things by herself." Stanley had the feeling that Zero was explaining things to himself. "She'd tell me to wait in a certain area for him. When I was real little, I had to wait in small areas, like on a porch step or a doorway. Now don't leave here until I got back," she said. "I never liked it when she left. I had a stuffed animal, a little giraffe, and I'd hug it the whole time when she was gone. When I was bigger, I was allowed to stay in the bigger areas, like stay on this block, or don't leave the park. But even then, I still held Jaffy." Stanley guessed that Jaffy was the name of Zero's giraffe. "Then, one day, she didn't come back," Zero said. His voice sounded hollow. "I waited for her at Lanny Park." "Lanny Park," said Stanley. "I've been there." "You know the playscape?" asked Zero. "Yeah, I played on it. I waited there for more than a month. You know that tunnel where you crawl through between the slide and the swinging bridge? That's where I slept." They ate 4 onions apiece and drank about half a jar of water. Stanley stood up and looked around. Everything looked the same in all directions. When I left camp, I headed straight towards Big Thumb. Then I saw the boat off to the right, so that means we have to turn a little to the left. Zero was lost in thought. What? Okay, he said. They headed out. It was Stanley's turn to carry the sack. Some kids at a birthday party once, Zero said. I guess it was about 2 weeks after my mother left. There was a picnic table next to the playscape and balloons were tied to it. The kids looked about the same age as me. One girl said hi to me and asked me if I wanted to play. I wanted to, but I didn't. I knew I didn't belong at the party, even though it wasn't their playscape. There was one mother who kept staring at me like I was some kind of monster. Then later, a boy asked me if I wanted a piece of cake. But then the mother told me, go away. She had told all the kids to stay away from me. So I never got the piece of cake. I ran away so fast I forgot Jaffe. Did you ever find him? It? For a moment, Zero didn't answer. Then he said, he wasn't real. Stanley thought again about his own parents. How awful it would be for them to never know if he was dead or alive. He realized how Zero must have felt, not knowing what happened to his own mother. He wondered why Zero never mentioned his father. Hold on, Zero said abruptly. We're going the wrong way. No, this is right, said Stanley. We're heading towards Big Thumb when he saw the boat off to the right. That means we should have turned right when we left the boat. You sure? Zero drew a diagram in the dirt. Stanley still wasn't sure. We need to go this way, Zero said, first drawing a line on the map, then heading that way himself. Stanley followed. It didn't feel right to him, but Zero seemed sure. Sometimes in the middle of the afternoon, a cloud drifted across the sky and blocked out the sun. It was a welcome relief. Once again, Stanley felt that destiny was on his side. Zero stopped and held out his arm to Stanley. Listen, Zero whispered. Stanley didn't hear anything. They continued walking very quietly, and Stanley began to make out the faint sounds of Camp Green Lake. They were too far away to see the camp, but they could hear a blend of indistinct voices. As they got closer, they could occasionally hear Mr. Sir's distinct bark. They walked slowly and quietly, aware that the sounds travel in both directions. They approached a cluster of holes. Let's wait here until they go in, said Zero. Stanley nodded. He checked to make sure there was nothing living in it, then climbed down into the hole. Zero climbed into the one next to him. Despite having gone the wrong way for a while, it hadn't taken them nearly as long as Stanley had expected. Now they just had to wait. The sun cut through the clouds, and Stanley felt its rays beating on him. But soon more clouds filled the sky, shading Stanley and his hole. He waited until he was certain the last of the campers had finished for the day. Then he waited for a bit longer. As quietly as possible, he and Zero climbed up out of their holes and crept towards camp. Stanley held the sack in front of him, cradling it in his arms, instead of over his shoulder, to keep the jars from clanking against each other. A wave of terror rushed over him when he saw the compound. The tents, the rec room, the warden's cabin under the 2 oak trees. The fear made him dizzy. He took a breath, summoned his courage, and continued. That's the one, he whispered, pointing out to the hole where he'd found the gold tomb. It was still about 50 yards away, but Stanley was pretty sure it was the right hole. There was no need to risk going any closer. They climbed down into adjacent holes and waited for the camp to fall asleep. Stanley tried to sleep, not knowing when he'd get the chance again. He heard the showers and later the sounds of dinner. He heard the creaking of the rec room floor, and his fingers drummed against the side of his hole as he waited. He heard his own heartbeat. He took a drink from his canteen. He had given Zero the water jars. They each had a good supply of onions. He wasn't sure how long he remained in the hole. Maybe 5 hours? He was surprised when he heard Zero whispering for him to wake up. He didn't think he'd fallen asleep. If he had, he thought it must have been just for the last 5 minutes. Although, when he opened his eyes, he was surprised how dark it was. There was only one light on the camp, in the office. The sky was cloudy, so there was very little starlight. Stanley could see the sliver of a moon which appeared and disappeared from among the clouds. He carefully led Zero to the hole, which was hard to find in the darkness. He stumbled over a small pile of dirt. "I think this is it," he whispered. "You think?" Zero asked. "It is," said Stanley, sounding more certain than he really was. He climbed down. Zero handed him the shovel. Stanley stuck the shovel into the dirt at the bottom of the hole and stepped on the back of the blade. He felt it sink beneath his weight. He scooped up some dirt and tossed it to the side. Then he brought the shovel back down. Zero watched for a while. "I'm going to go refill the water jars," he said. Stanley took a deep breath and exhaled. "Be careful," he said. Then he continued digging. It was so dark, he couldn't even see the end of his own shovel. For all he knew, he could be digging up gold and diamonds instead of dirt. He brought each shovelful close to his face to try to see if there was anything in it, before dumping it out over the hole. As he made the hole deeper, it became harder to lift the dirt up and out. It was 5 feet deep before he even started. He decided to use his efforts to make it wider instead. This made more sense, he told him. If Kate Barlow had buried a treasure chest, she probably wouldn't have been able to dig much deeper, so why should he? Of course, Kate Barlow probably had a whole gang of thieves helping her. "You want some breakfast?" Stanley jumped at the sound of Zero's voice. He hadn't heard him approach. Zero handed down a box of cereal. Stanley carefully poured some cereal into his mouth. He didn't want to use his dirty hands inside the box. He nearly gagged on the ultra-sweet taste. These were sugar-frosted flakes, but after eating nothing but onions for more than a week, he had trouble adjusting to the flavor. He washed them down with a swig of water. Zero took over digging. Stanley sifted his fingers through the fresh piles of dirt, in case he had missed anything. He wished he had a flashlight. A diamond no bigger than a pebble would be worth thousands of dollars. Yet there would be no way to see it. They finished the water that Zero had gotten from the spigot by the showers. Stanley said he'd fill the jars again, but Zero insisted that he'd do it. "No offense, but you make too much noise when you walk. You're too big." Stanley returned to the hole. As the hole grew wider, parts of the surface kept caving in. They were running out of room. To make it much wider, they would have to move some of the surrounding dirt piles out of the way. He wondered how much time they had before the camp woke up. "How's it going?" Zero asked when he returned with the water. Stanley shrugged one shoulder. He brought the shovel down the side of the hole, shaving off a slice of dirt wall. As he did that, he felt the shovel bounce off something hard. "What was that?" Zero asked. Stanley didn't know. He moved his shovel up and down the side of the hole. As the dirt chipped and flaked away, the hard object became more pronounced. It was sticking out of the side of the hole, about 1.5 feet from the bottom. He felt it with his hands. "What is it?" Zero asked. He could just feel a corner of it. Most of it was still buried. It had the cool, smooth texture of metal. "I think I might have found the treasure chest," he said. His voice was filled with more astonishment than excitement. "Really?" asked Zero. "I think so," Stanley said. The hole was wide enough for him to hold the shovel lengthwise and dig sideways into the wall. He knew he had to dig very carefully. He didn't want the side of the hole to collapse, along with the huge dirt pile directly above it. He scraped at the dirt wall until it exposed an entire side of the box-like object. He ran his fingers over it. It had felt to be 8 inches tall and almost 2 feet wide. He had no way of knowing how far into the earth it extended. He tried pulling it out, but it wouldn't budge. He was afraid that the only way to get it out was to start back up at the surface and dig down. They didn't have time for that, though. I'm going to try to dig a hole underneath it. Maybe then I could pull it down and slip it out. Go for it, said Zero. Stanley jammed the shovel into the bottom edge of the hole and began carefully digging a tunnel underneath the metal object. He hoped it didn't cave in. Occasionally he stopped, scooped down, and tried to feel the far edge of the box. But even when the tunnel was as long as his arm, he still couldn't feel the other side. Once again he tried pulling it out, but it was too firmly in the ground. If he pulled too hard, he feared he would cause a cave-in. He knew that when he was ready to pull it out, he would have to do it quickly before the ground above it collapsed. As this tunnel grew deeper and wider and more precarious, Stanley was able to feel latches on one end of the box and a leather handle. It wasn't really a box. I think it might be some kind of metal suitcase, he told Zero. Can you pry it loose with the shovel? Zero suggested. I'm afraid that the side of the hole will collapse. You might as well give it a try, said Zero. Stanley took a sip of water. Might as well, he said. He forced the tip of the shovel between the dirt and the top of the metal case and tried to wedge it free. He wished he could see what he was doing. He worked the end of the shovel back and forth, up and down, until he felt the suitcase fall free. Then he felt the dirt piling down on top of it. It wasn't a huge cave-in. As he knelt down in the hole, he could tell that only a small portion of the earth had collapsed. He dug with his hands until he found the leather handle, and he pulled the suitcase up and out of the dirt. I got it, he exclaimed. It was heavy. He handed it up to Zero. You did it, Zero said, taking it from him. We did it, said Stanley. He gathered up his remaining strength and tried to pull himself up out of the hole. Suddenly, a bright light was shining in his face. Thank you, said the warden. You boys have been a big help. The beam of the flashlight was directed away from Stanley's eyes and onto Zero, who was sitting on his knees. The suitcase was on his lap. Mr. Budensky was holding the flashlight. Mr. Sir stood next to him with his gun drawn and pointed in the same direction. Mr. Sir was barefoot and bare-chested, only wearing his pajama bottoms. The warden moved towards Zero. She was also in her bedclothes, although wearing an extra long t-shirt. However, unlike Mr. Sir, she had her own boots. Mr. Budensky was the only one fully dressed. Perhaps he had been the one on guard. Off in the distance, Stanley could see two more flashlights bobbing towards them in the darkness. He felt helpless in his hole. The boys just arrived in the nick of time, the warden had just started to say. She stopped talking and she stopped walking. Then she slowly backed away. A lizard had crawled up on top of the suitcase. Its big red eyes glowed in the beam of the flashlight. Its mouth was open, and Stanley could see its white tongue moving in and out between its black teeth. Zero stood as still as a statue. A second lizard crawled up over the side of the suitcase and stopped less than an inch away from Zero's little finger. Stanley was afraid to look and afraid not to. He wondered if he should try to scramble out of the hole before the lizards turned on him. But he didn't want to cause any commotion. The second lizard crawled across Zero's finger and halfway up his arm. It occurred to Stanley that the lizards were probably on the suitcase when he handed it to Zero. "There's another one!" gasped Mr. Budensky. He shined the flashlight on the box of Frosted Flakes, which lay on its side beside Stanley's hole. A lizard was crawling out of it. The light also illuminated Stanley's hole. He glanced downward and had to force himself to suppress a yelp. He was standing in a lizard nest. He felt the scream explode inside him. He could see 6 lizards. There were 3 on the ground, 2 on his leg, and 1 on his right sneaker. He tried to remain very still. Something was crawling up the back of his neck. 3 other counselors approached the area. Stanley heard one say, "What's going?" and then whisper, "Oh my God." "What do we do?" asked Mr. Podensky. "We wait," said the warden. "It won't be very long. At least we'll have a body to give that stupid woman," said Mr. Podensky. "She's going to ask a lot of questions, though," said Mr. Sir. "And this time she'll have the AG with her." "Let her ask her questions," said the warden. "Just as long as I have the suitcase, I don't care what happens. Do you know how long?" Her voice trailed off, then started up again. "When I was little, I'd watch my parents dig holes every weekend and holiday. When I got bigger, I had to dig too, even on Christmas." Stanley felt tiny claws dig into the side of his face as the lizard pulled itself off his neck and up past his chin. "It won't be very long now," said the warden. Stanley could hear his heart beat. Every beat told him he was still alive, at least for 1 more second. 500 seconds later, his heart was still beating. Mr. Podensky screamed. The lizard, which had been in the cereal box, was springing towards him. Mr. Sir shot it in midair. Stanley felt a blast shatter the air around him. The lizard scurried frantically across his very still body. He did not flinch. A lizard ran across his closed mouth. He glanced at Zero, and Zero's eyes met with his. Somehow, they were still alive, both alive, at least for 1 more second. 1 more heartbeat. Mr. Sir lit a cigarette. "I thought you quit," said one of the other counselors. "Yeah, well, sometimes sunflower seeds just don't cut it." He took a long drag on his cigarette. "I'm going to have nightmares the rest of my life." "Maybe we should just shoot them," suggested Miss Podensky. "Who?" asked a counselor. "The lizards or the kids?" Mr. Podensky laughed grimly. "The kids are going to die anyway." He laughed again. "At least we'll have plenty of graves to choose from." "We've got time," said the warden. "I've waited this long. I can wait another few." Her voice trailed off. Stanley felt a lizard crawl in and out of his pocket. "We're going to keep our story simple," said the warden. "That woman's going to ask a lot of questions. The AG will most likely initiate an investigation. So this is what happened. Stanley tried to run away in the night, fell in a hole, and the lizards got him. That's it. We're not even going to give them Zero's body. As far as anyone knows, Zero doesn't exist. Like Mom said, we've got plenty of graves to choose from." "Why would he run away if he knew he was getting released today?" asked Mr. Podensky. "Who knows? He's crazy. That's why we couldn't release him yesterday. He was delirious, and we had to keep watch over him so he wouldn't hurt himself or anybody else." "She's not going to like it," said Mr. Podensky. "She's not going to like anything we tell her," said the warden. She stared at Zero and at the suitcase. "Why aren't you dead yet?" she asked. Stanley only half listened to the talk of the counselors. He didn't know who that woman was or what AG meant. He didn't even realize there were initials. It sounded like one word, AG. His mind was focused on the tiny claws that moved up and down his skin and through his hair. He tried to think about other things. He didn't want to die with the images of the warden, Mr. Sir, and the lizards etched into his brain. Instead, he tried to see his mother's face. His brain took him back to the time when he was very little, all bundled up in a snowsuit. He and his mother were walking, hand in hand, mitten in mitten, when they both slipped on some ice and fell and rolled down a snow-covered hillside. They ended up at the bottom of the hill. He remembered he almost cried, but instead he laughed. His mother laughed too. He could feel the same light-headed feeling he felt then, dizzy from rolling down the hill. He felt the sharp coldness of the snow against his ear. He could see flecks of snow on his mother's bright and cheery face. This is where he wanted to be when he died. "Hey, caveman, guess what?" said Mr. Sir. "You're innocent after all. I thought you'd like to know. Your lawyer came here yesterday. Too bad you weren't here." The words meant nothing to Stanley, who was still in the snow. He and his mother climbed back up the hill and rolled down again, this time on purpose. Later they had hot chocolate with lots of melted marshmallows. "It's getting closer to 4:30, said Mr. Podensky. "They'll be waking up." The warden told the counselors to return to the tents. She told them to give campers breakfast and make sure they didn't talk to anybody. As long as they did as they were told, they wouldn't have to dig any more holes. If they talked, they would be severely punished. "How should we say they'll be punished?" one of the counselors asked. "Let them use their imaginations," said the warden. Stanley watched the counselors return to the tents, leaving only the warden and Mr. Sir behind. He knew the warden didn't care whether the campers dug any more holes or not. She'd found what she was looking for. He glanced at Zero. A lizard was perched on his shoulder. Zero remained perfectly still except for his right hand, which slowly formed into a fist. Then he raised his thumb, giving Stanley the thumbs up sign. Stanley thought back to what Mr. Sir had said to him earlier, and the bits of conversation he had overheard. He tried to make sense out of it. Mr. Sir had said something about a lawyer, but Stanley knew his parents couldn't afford a lawyer. His legs were sore from remaining rigid for so long. Standing still was more strenuous than walking. He slowly allowed himself to lean against the side of the hole. The lizards didn't seem to mind. The sun was up, and Stanley's heart was still beating. There were 8 lizards in the hole with him. Each one had exactly 11 yellow spots. The warden had dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep, and lines under her forehead and face, which seemed exaggerated in the stark morning light. Her skin looked blotchy. "Satan," said Zero. Stanley looked at him, unsure if Zero had even spoken or if he'd imagined it. "Why don't you go see if you can take the suitcase from Zero?" the warden suggested. "Yeah, right," said Mr. Sir. "The lizards obviously aren't hungry," said the warden. "Then you go get the suitcase," said Mr. Sir. They waited. "Satan Lee," said Zero. Sometime later, Stanley saw a tarantula crawl across the dirt, not too far away from his hole. He had never seen a tarantula before, but there was no doubt what it was. He was momentarily fascinated by it, by its long, hairy body moved slowly and steadily across. "Look, a tarantula!" said Mr. Sir, also fascinated. I've never seen one, said the warden, except in... Stanley suddenly felt a sharp sting on the side of his neck. The lizard hadn't bitten him, however. It was merely pushing off. It leapt off Stanley's neck and pounced on the tarantula. The last Stanley saw of it was one hairy leg sticking out of the lizard's mouth. Not hungry, huh? Said Mr. Sir. Stanley tried to return to the snow, but it was harder to get there when the sun was up. As the sun rose, the lizards moved slower and lower in the hole, keeping mainly in the shade. They were no longer on his head and shoulders, but had moved down to his stomach, legs, and feet. He couldn't see any lizards on Zero, but believed there were two, between Zero's knees, shaded from the sun by the suitcase. How are you doing? Stanley asked quietly. He didn't whisper, but his mouth was dry and raspy. My legs are numb, said Zero. I'm gonna try to climb out of the hole, Stanley said. As he tried to pull himself up, using just his arms, he felt a claw dig into his ankle. He gently eased himself back down. Is your last name your first name backwards? Stanley asked. Stanley stared at him in amazement. Had he been working on that all night? Stanley heard the sound of approaching cars. Mr. Sir and the warden heard it as well. You think it's them? Asked the warden. It ain't Girl Scouts selling cookies, said Mr. Sir. He heard the cars come to a stop, and then doors open and shut. A little while later, he saw Mr. Podensky and two strangers coming across the lake. One was a tall man in a business suit and a cowboy hat. The other was a short woman holding a briefcase. The woman had to take 3 steps for every 2 taken by the man. Stanley Yellnuts, she called, moving out ahead of the others. I suggest you don't come any closer, said Mr. Sir. You can't stop me, she snapped, then took a second glance at him, wearing pajama pants and nothing else. We'll get you out of there, Stanley, she said. Don't you worry. She appeared to be Hispanic, with straight black hair and dark eyes. She spoke with a little bit of a Mexican accent, trailing her R's. What in tarnation? The tall man exclaimed as he came up behind her. She turned on him. I'm telling you right now, if any harm comes to him, we will be filing charges not only against Mrs. Walker and the Camp Green Lake, but the entire state of Texas as well. Child abuse, false imprisonment, torture. The man was more than a head taller than she, and was able to look directly over her as he spoke to the warden. How long have they been there? All night, as you can see by the way they're dressed. They snuck out of my cabin while I was asleep and stole my suitcase. I chased after them, and they ran out here and fell into the lizard's nest. I don't know what they were thinking. That's not true, Stanley said. Stanley, as your attorney, I advise you not to say anything, said the warden, until you and I have had a chance to talk in privacy. Stanley wondered why the warden lied about the suitcase. He wondered who it legally belonged to. There was only one thing he wanted to ask the lawyer, if she really was his lawyer. It's a miracle they're still alive, said the tall man. Yes, it is, the warden agreed, with just a trace of disappointment in her voice. And they better come out of this alive, Stanley's lawyer warned. This wouldn't have happened if you released him to me yesterday morning. It wouldn't have happened if you hadn't been a little lying, cheating thief, said the warden. I told him he would be set free today, and I guess he decided to try to take some of my valuables with him. He's been delirious for the past week. Why didn't you release him when she came to you yesterday? The tall man asked. She didn't have the proper authority, said the warden. I had a court order, It was not authenticized, the warden said. Authenticized. It was signed by the judge who sentenced him. I needed it authentically from the Attorney General, said the warden. How do I know it's legitimate? The boy in my custody have proved themselves dangerous to society. Am I supposed to just turn them loose any time someone hands me a piece of paper? Yes, said the woman. If it's a court order. Stanley has been hospitalized for the last few days, the warden explained. He's been suffering from hallucinations and delirium. Raving and ranting. He was in no condition to leave. In fact, that he was trying to steal from me on the day before his release proves. Stanley tried to climb out of his hole, using mainly his arms, so not to disturb the lizards too much. As he pulled himself upwards, the lizards moved downwards, keeping out of the sun's direct rays. He swung his legs up and over, and the last of the lizards hopped off. Thank God! Exclaimed the warden. She started towards him, then stopped. A lizard crawled out of his pocket and down his leg. Stanley was overcome by a rush of dizziness and almost fell over. He steadied himself and reached down, took hold of Zero's arm, and helped him slowly to his feet. Zero still held the suitcase. The lizards, which had been hiding under it, scurried quickly into the hole. Stanley and Zero staggered away. The warden rushed to them. She hugged Zero. Thank God you're alive, she said. She tried to take the suitcase from him. He jerked it free. It belongs to Stanley, he said. Don't cause any more trouble, the warden warned. You stole it from my cabin and you've been caught red-handed. If I press charges, Stanley might have to return to prison. Now I'm willing, in view of the circumstances, too. It's got his name on it, said Zero. Stanley's lawyer pushed past the tall man to have a look. See, Zero showed her. Stanley Yellnuts. Stanley looked too. There, in big black letters, was Stanley Yellnuts. The tall man looked over the heads of the others at the name of the suitcase. You say he stole it from your cabin? The warden stared at him, as if in disbelief. That's impossible, she said. She couldn't even say it. They slowly walked back to camp. The tall man was in Texas Attorney General, the chief law enforcement officer of the state. Stanley's lawyer was named Miss Mongrel. Stanley held the suitcase. He was so tired he couldn't even think straight. He felt as if he was walking in a dream, not quite able to comprehend what was going on around him. They stopped in front of the camp office. Mr. Sir went inside to get Stanley's belongings. The Attorney General told Mr. Podensky to get the boys something to drink and eat. The warden seemed as dazed as Stanley. You couldn't even read, she said to Zero. Zero said nothing. Miss Mongrel put a hand on Stanley's shoulder and told him to hang in there. He would be seeing his parents shortly. She was shorter than Stanley, but somehow gave the appearance of being tall. Mr. Podensky returned with 2 cartons of orange juice and 2 bagels. Stanley drank the juice, but didn't feel like eating anything. Wait! The warden exclaimed. It didn't say they stole the suitcase. It's his suitcase, but he put it in he put my things from my cabin inside it. That isn't what you said earlier, said Miss Mongrel. What's in the suitcase? The warden asked Stanley. Tell us what's in it and we'll open it and see. Stanley didn't know what to do. Stanley, as your lawyer, I advise you not to open the suitcase, said Miss Mongrel. He has to open it, said the warden. I have the right to check the personal property of any of the attendants. How do I know there aren't drugs or weapons in there? He stole a car, too. I've got witnesses. She was nearly hysterical. He is no longer under your hold, said Stanley's lawyer. He has not been officially released, said the warden. open the suitcase, Stanley." "Do not open it," said Stanley's lawyer. Stanley did nothing. Mr. Sir returned from the office with Stanley's backpack and clothes. The Attorney General handed Miss Monroe a sheet of paper. "You're free to go," he said to Stanley. "I know you're anxious to get out of here, so you can just keep the orange suit as a souvenir, or burn it, whatever you want. Good luck, Stanley." He returned out to shake his hand, but Miss Monroe hurried Stanley away. "Come on, Stanley," she said. "We have a lot to talk about." Stanley stopped and turned to look at Zero. He couldn't just leave him there. Zero gave him a thumbs up. "I can't leave Hector," Stanley said. "I suggest we go," said the lawyer with a sense of urgency in her voice. "I'll be okay," said Zero. His eyes shifted towards Mr. Podetsky on one side of him, then to the warden, then Mr. Sir on the other. "There's nothing I can do for your friend," said Miss Monroe. "You are released pursuant to an order from the judge." "They'll kill him," said Stanley. "Your friend is not in any danger," said the Attorney General. "There's going to be an investigation into everything that's happening here. For the present, I am taking charge of the camp." "Come on, Stanley," said his lawyer. "Your parents are waiting." Stanley stayed where he was. The lawyer sighed. "May I have a look at Hector's file?" she said. "Certainly," said the Attorney General. "Miss Walker, go get Hector's file." She looked at him blankly. "Well?" The warden turned to Mr. Podetsky. "Bring me Hector Zeroni's file." He stared at her. "Get it!" she ordered. Mr. Podetsky went into the office. He returned a few minutes later and announced that the file was apparently misplaced. The Attorney General was outraged. "What kind of camp are you running here, Miss Walker?" The warden said nothing. She stared at the suitcase. The Attorney General assured Stanley's lawyer that he would get the records. "Excuse me while I call my office." He turned back to the warden. "I assume the phone here works?" He walked into the camp office, slamming the door behind him. A little while later, he reappeared and told the warden he wanted to talk to her. She cursed and then went inside. Stanley gave Zero the thumbs up. "Caveman, is that you?" He turned to see Armpit and Squid coming out of the rec room. Squid backed into the rec room. "Caveman and Zero are here!" Soon all the boys from Group D had gathered around him and Zero. "Good to see you, my man," Armpit said, shaking his hand. "We thought you were buzzard food." "Stanley is being released today," said Mr. Podetsky. "Way to go," said Magnet, hitting him on the shoulder. "And you didn't even have to step on a rattlesnake," said Squid. Even Zigzag shook Stanley's hand. Sorry about you know." "It's cool," said Stanley. "We had to lift the truck clear out of the hole," Zigzag told him. "It took everybody in C, D, and E. We just picked it right up." "It was really cool," said Twitch. X-Ray was the only one who didn't come over. Stanley saw him hang back behind the others, then returned to the rec room. "Guess what?" said Magnet, glancing at Mr. Podetsky. "Mom says we don't have to dig any more holes." "That's great," Stanley said. "Will you do me a favor?" asked Squid. "I guess," Stanley agreed, somewhat hesitant. "I want you to." He turned to Miss Monroe. "Hey, lady, do you have a pen or paper I can borrow?" She gave it to him. Then Squid wrote down the phone number which he gave to Stanley. "Call my mom for me, okay? Tell her I was sorry. Tell her Alan said he was sorry." Stanley promised he would. "Now you be careful out in the real world," said Armpit. "Not everybody is as nice as us." Stanley smiled. The boys departed when the warden came out of the office. The Attorney General was right behind her. "My office is having some difficulty locating Hector Zeroni's files," the Attorney General said. "So you have no claim of authority over him?" asked Warden, as Miss Monroe. I didn't say that. He's in the computer. We just can't access his records. It's like they've fallen through a hole in cyberspace." "A hole in cyberspace?" Miss Monroe repeated. How interesting. When is his release date? I don't know. How long has he been here? Like I said, we can't locate his file. So when are you planning to do with him? Keep him confined indefinitely without justification? Will you go crawling through black holes in cyberspace? The Attorney General stared at her. He was obviously incarcerated for a reason. Oh, and what reason is that? The Attorney General said nothing. Stanley the lawyer took hold of Zero's hand. Come on, Hector, you're coming with us. There never used to be yellow-spotted lizards in the town of Green Lake. They didn't come into the area until after the lake dried up. But the townsfolk had heard about the red-eyed monsters living in the desert hills. One afternoon, Sam the Onion Man and his donkey Mary Lou were returning to his boat, which was anchored just a little offshore. It was late in November, and the peach trees had lost most of their leaves. Sam! Someone called. He turned around to see 3 men running after him, waving their hats. He waited. Afternoon, Walker, Joe, and Bess. He greeted them as he walked up, catching their breath. Glad we caught you, said Bo. We're going rattlesnake hunting in the morning. We wanted to get some of your lizard juice, said Walter. I ain't no scared of a rattlesnake, said Lizard, but I don't want to come across one of those red-eyed monsters. I've seen one once, and that was enough. I knew about the red eyes, of course, but I hadn't heard about the big black teeth. It's the white tongues that got me, said Bo. Sam gave each man 2 bottles of pure onion juice. He told them to drink 1 bottle before going to bed that night, and half a bottle in the morning, then half a bottle around lunchtime. You sure this stuff works? Asked Walter. I tell you what, said Sam. If it doesn't, you can come back next week and I'll give you your money back. Walter looked around, unsure, as Bo and Jessie laughed. Then Sam laughed too. Even Mary Lou let out a rare hee-haw. And just remember, Sam told the men before they left, it's very important that you drink a bottle tonight. You got to get it into your bloodstream. The lizards don't like onion blood. Stanley and Zero sat in the back seat of Mrs. Monroe's BMW. The suitcase lay between them. It was locked, of course, and they decided they'd let Stanley's father try to open it in his workshop. You really don't know what's in it, do you? She asked. No, said Stanley. I didn't think so. The air conditioning was on, but they drove with the windows open as well because, no offense, boys, but you really smell bad. Miss Monroe explained that she was a patient attorney. I'm helping your father with a new product he's inventing. He happened to mention your situation, so I decided to do a little investigating. Clyde Livingston's sneakers were stolen around the time before 3:15. I found a young man, Derek Doone, who said that it was at 3:20 you were in the bathroom fishing your notebook out of the toilet. 2 girls remembered seeing you come out of the boys' restroom carrying a wet notebook. Stanley felt his ears redden. Even after everything he'd been through, the memory still caused him to feel shame. So you couldn't have stolen them, said Miss Monroe. He didn't. I did, said Zero. You did what? Asked Miss Monroe. I stole the sneakers. The lawyer actually turned around while driving and looked at him. I didn't hear that, she said. I'd advise you to make sure I didn't hear it again. What did my father invent? Stanley asked. Did he find a way to recycle sneakers? No, he's still working on that, explained Miss Monroe. But he'd invented a product that eliminates foot odor. Here, I've got a sample in my briefcase. I wish I had a bit more. You 2 could bathe in it. She opened her briefcase with one hand and passed a small bottle back to Stanley. It had a fresh and somewhat spicy smell. He handed it to Zero. What's it called? Stanley asked. He hadn't come up with a name yet, said Miss Monroe. It smells familiar, said Zero. Peaches, right? Asked Miss Monroe. That's what everybody says. A short while later, both boys fell asleep. Behind them, the sky had turned dark, and for the first time in over 100 years, a drop of rain fell into the empty lake. Part 3. Filling in the holes. Stanley's mother insisted that there never was a curse. She even doubted whether Stanley's great-great-grandfather really had stolen a pig. The reader might find it interesting, however, that Stanley's father invented his cure for foot odor the day after his great-great-grandfather, son of Elia Yelnuts, carried the great-great-great-grandson of Madame Zeroni up the mountain. The Attorney General closed Camp Green Lake. Miss Walker, who was in desperate need of money, had to sell the land which had been in her family for generations. It was bought by a national organization dedicated to the well-being of young girls. In a few years, Camp Green Lake will become a Girl Scouts camp. This is pretty much the end of the story. The reader probably still has some questions, but unfortunately from here on in, the answers tend to be long and tedious. While Miss Bell, Stanley's former math teacher, might want to know the percentage in Stanley's weight, the reader probably cares more about the change in Stanley's character and self-confidence. But those changes are subtle and hard to measure. There's no simple answer. Even the contents of the suitcase, which turned out to be somewhat tedious. Stanley's father pried it open in his workshop, and everyone first grasped at the sparkling jewels. Stanley thought he and Hector had become millionaires. But the jewels were of poor quality, worth no more than $20,000. Underneath the jewels was a stack of paper that once belonged to the first Stanley Yelnuts. They were considered stock certificates, deeds of trust, and promissory notes. They were hard to read and more difficult to understand. Miss Monger's law firm spent more than 2 months going through all the papers. It turned out to be a lot more valuable than the jewels. After legal fees and taxes, Stanley and Zero each received less than $1 million. But not a lot less. It was enough for Stanley to buy his family a new house with a laboratory in the basement, and for Hector he required a team of private investigators. But it would be boring to go through all the tedious details of all the changes in their lives. Instead, the reader will be presented with one last scene, which took place almost a year and a half after Stanley and Hector left Camp Green Lake. You will have to fill in the holes yourself. There was a small party at Yelnut's house. Except for Stanley and Hector, everyone was an adult. All kinds of snacks and drinks were set out on the counter, including caviar, champagne, and the fixing to make an ice cream sundaes. The Super Bowl was on television, but nobody was really watching. It should be coming on at the next break, Miss Monroe announced. A timeout was called in the football game, and a commercial came on the screen. Everybody stopped talking and watched. The commercial showed a baseball game. Amid a cloud of dust, Clyde Livingston slid into home plate as the catcher caught the ball and tried to tag him out. "Safe!" shouted the umpire as he signaled with his arms. The people at Stanley's house cheered as if the run really counted. Clyde Livingston got up and dusted the dirt off his uniform. As he made his way back to the dugout, he spoke to the Clyde camera. "Hi, I'm Clyde Livingston, but everyone here calls me Sweet Feet." "Way to go, Sweet Feet," said another baseball player, slapping his hand. Besides being on television screen, Clyde Livingston was also sitting on the couch next to Stanley. "But my feet weren't always so sweet," the television Clyde Livingston said as he sat down on the dugout bench. "They used to smell so bad that nobody would sit near me in the dugout." "They really did stink," said the woman sitting on the couch on the other side of Clyde Livingston. She held her nose with one hand and fanned the air with the other. Clyde shushed her. "Then a teammate told me about sploosh," said the television Clyde. He pulled a can of sploosh out from under the dugout bench and held it up for everyone to see. I spray a little on each foot every morning, and now I really do have sweet feet. Plus, I like the tingle. Sploosh, said a voice. A treat for your feet. Made from all natural ingredients, it neutralizes odor, causing fungi and bacteria. Plus, you'll like the tingle. Everyone at the party clapped their hands. He wasn't lying, said the woman sat next to Clyde. I couldn't even be in the same room with his socks. The other people at the party laughed. The woman continued. I'm not joking. It was so bad. You've made your point, said Clyde, covering her mouth with his hand. He looked back at Stanley. Will you do me a favor, Stanley? Stanley raised and lowered his left shoulder. I'm going to get more caviar, said Clyde. Keep your hand over my wife's mouth. He patted Stanley on the shoulder as he rose from the couch. Stanley looked uncertainly at his hand and then at Clyde Livingston's wife. She winked at him. He felt himself blush, then turned towards Hector, who was sitting on the floor in front of the overstuffed couch. The woman sitting in the chair behind Hector was absent-mindedly fluffing his hair with her fingers. She wasn't very old, but her skin had a weathered look to him. It almost looked like leather. Her eyes seemed weary, as if she'd seen too many things in her life that she didn't want to see. And when she smiled, her mouth seemed too big for her face. Very softly, she half sang, half hummed a song that her grandmother used to sing to her when she was a little girl. If only the moon speaks no reply, reflecting the sun and all that's gone by. Be strong, my weary wolf, and turn around boldly. Fly high, my baby bird, my angel, my only.